Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at this review copy I was sent of Xanadu, which is a weird fantasy role-playing adventure created by Vasily Kalaman and designed for use with old school essentials. It's done in this very compact, very nice format. It's all paperback. Cover and the back cover are in color, and some of the interiors are in color as well. It has stapled binding here, which means that the whole thing's going to lie completely flat when you open it, which is a really big benefit when it comes to usability. There's this pixel art style that's used throughout, which I think is quite effective. Before we get inside, a quick shout out to some of our new patrons over on Patreon, including Kyle Knott, Zachary Murray, Eric Brimstem, Malasier, Jamie Brittain, Tim Pudoff, Michael DeRosa, Dice Goblin, Imad Otala, CK International Baby, and The Wrong Room. Thanks so much for helping to support the channel. So this adventure starts off right away with a map on the inside cover, which is really great, and a key for the map right on the other side. I really like this layout because you just open to the very first page and you immediately get an overview of the adventure as a whole. Just by reading these short little keys, you get a very clear sense of what the adventure is about and what's going to be in each room. I think the only way it could be improved would be to somehow have these descriptions closer to the rooms themselves, so you don't have to kind of jump back and forth. It's a little bit hard to see how you would do that with this size of a map, though, so maybe this is the best way to do it. The main criticism I have here is not to do with the cartography, but just looking at the map as a whole, I can see that there are a lot of rooms, especially this big area here and this big area here, which seem like they would be quite difficult to describe to players if you're doing detailed mapping. Perhaps you could resolve this by giving players a map at the beginning that they are filling in, or maybe drawing it yourself and then simply handing it to them. But these are some very awkwardly shaped spaces, which I think I would have a hard time getting across to players with any accuracy. So we have, again, the pixel art style continues on the inside, and we have our cover page here. Cartography is done by Dice and Logos, and it's published by Singing Flame OSR. As usual, links are going to be down in the description below if you'd like to pick this up for yourself. So right away we have player generation. You use your typical old school rules. I would assume old school essentials in order to run it. We have a basic overview of where this is and some referee advice. Some background of what was happening here at the cult. The main villain in this case is the Tooth Fairy, which is this horrible demonic being from another dimension full of candy that comes through a portal and wreaked havoc in this temple, and it's still haunting there, or at least it can be unleashed if the players summon it in the correct way. It's also left behind a number of horrible creatures which the players can encounter as they go through. There's some adventure hooks done into some different categories: investigation, coming home, rivals, and so on. So you can pick whichever one is going to fit best with the campaign that you're writing, if this is part of a campaign. We have some cult names and rumors. So we have lots of different cults that you can use to be the cult that used to be here in this temple. It is a D16 table, which is a little unusual. I saw that a couple times throughout this adventure where it uses unusual dice sizes, which is a little annoying to me. You could just roll a D20 and then ignore anything higher than a 16. But really, it's not a standard dice size, so it's going to be slightly awkward to work with. We have some starting arcana, which I think is a really fun idea, just because it gives players something weird to work with, something which could be useful if they play their cards correctly. Perhaps there's something like a bag that always has 15 marbles inside, or maybe a mirror shows anything reflected in it, but something is always missing. Perhaps you could use that to trick an enemy somehow. Some of these seem less useful, some more useful. It's going to be up to player creativity there. So starting out, you can approach the entrance to the temple itself and walk through, though of course there will be a random effect as you go through. Roll 2d12. And most of these are a lot of fun in that they just start applying weird mutations and effects to players that of course are going to change them over time. Downside is that if you roll 2 12s, you explode on arrival and you have instant death. There are a couple of these throughout the adventure where if you just roll the wrong dice, basically your character just dies. I'm not a huge fan of those. I tend I don't shy away from having player death, or character death rather, but if the PC is going to die, then I prefer to have it signposted a bit more rather than having it just be random. So I might change some of these more lethal entries to something still bad, but it's not going to take them out, because they didn't really make a bad choice there. They were just trying to start the adventure at the very beginning. We have some monsters you run into right away. We have these glowing lanterns that float around the main hall that we see here that you can fight. And they are explosive, so they can set off chain reactions as they blow up. That's one issue that I think would be a little bit difficult to run, because the number of them that show up, it's 1d20 plus 10. So you could have as many as 30 of these glowing lanterns floating around. And there's rules that say that any lantern within 5 feet of a lantern that combusted has a 50% chance of exploding. So that means that to run this as it's written here, you would really need to keep track of all 30 lanterns. Maybe it's less than that, but still, that's a lot of things to individually keep track of. You might want to abstract that a bit to make it a bit easier to run. Most of the layout is really good. The bold red headings for each room make it very easy to pick out. The way that bolding is used to highlight the most important objects and features within each room is also great. Just by scanning this, you can figure out how the room runs very quickly. It's a big improvement over the way that a lot of D&D adventures are structured. Right, so basically you have a short section at the beginning which kind of gives you an overview. Shelves and cupboards, wooden, numerous, smells like rotting food. And then any of these bolded features can have a section underneath it that goes into more detail if the players examine or they get closer to it. There's plenty of all sorts of unusual effects. We have weird books that they can find. We have more mutations that can apply to players. And there's quite a few strange items that they can run into as well that they can pick up and use throughout the adventure and then further on if you keep going. We have some really interesting fight scenes, including the Phase Daughters. This is a creature that is kind of fused into the wall itself, and then will emerge out, try and grab you, and pull you down into the stone. So that can create a really interesting fight scene where players can use unusual tactics in order to deal with it. Almost every room has something unusual in it. For example, we have the Silent Sanctum. Includes a cloth map with the campaign world in it. And you open up the writing desk, you get spell books, there's a marriage certificate, armor oil. Almost every room, if you dig around and you look into the corners, there's going to be something there to reward you for spending that time. We have weird items like this one, the Serenader's Visor. So you put it on and it fuses to your skull, so it's basically impossible to take off. Once per day, it can be commanded to sing one of the following two songs. The Song of Death. Any enemies within a 30-foot radius must save versus spells or potentially be obliterated for 4d8 damage, which is spread equally amongst those who fail to save. Or the Song of Valor, which boosts your friend's attacks. The complication is that it demands life energy from the wearer, leaching pigment from the skin and internal organs, so you slowly turn translucent so people can see your internal organs, which is nice and creepy. And the wearer ages twice as fast and loses 30% of their earned XP. So if you're willing to take that hit, it could be a great visor, although it's not going to be obvious that it's going to be impossible to remove, at least right away. All sorts of unusual monsters. We have acid bladders that you can fight, and the Tooth Fairy itself, which can be summoned through a summoning ritual where, of course, you have to collect teeth and offer it to this being in the hopes that it comes through to reward you. And it might reward you, but more likely it's just going to try and eat you. Some of its specials include that all damage rolled against it is added to its total, so it absorbs damage that it inflicts on other people, rather. If it's seriously threatened, it will retreat back into the portal. And if it's destroyed, teeth that she has summoned during summoning have all transformed into glittering diamonds within her belly that you can retrieve. We have the Seamstress, the Garden, and another monster at the very end. The Filth that you can encounter. These were creatures that were previously living inside the dungeon before it was taken over and destroyed by the Tooth Fairy. One unusual feature is that there isn't really any random encounters designed for this dungeon. That does make it a bit unusual for an old school adventure. Of course, you could add your own or put some of the monsters that are already in here onto a random encounter table. But I think the intent is that you just explore from room to room and find the monsters yourself. One critique that I have here is that there's a section called the clocks. So no doors, 2 open entrances. There's pendulum clocks, 3 of them standing on the wall. And by getting the clocks into the correct alignment, you can have effects that affect the rest of the dungeon in some way. What I would have liked to see here is a system where the players can actually figure out how to solve the puzzle and then do it themselves. But the way that it's doing right here, it seems it's basically a randomized flowchart. So you just solve it. You start at the top right here, so 1 PC per attempt, and then you roll a die, a D10. And then these arrows have numbers on them, which tells you where you go. So a 1 through 5, I think, you would go over here. If you rolled a 6 through 10, you would go here. If you rolled an 8, 9, or a 0, you would go over here. And then you just continue rolling from point to point, trying to get to the solved section. And if you go to the uh-oh section, then something bad happens. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of player choice each time that they do this. They just kind of keep rolling until they end up at one place or another. So I'm a little unclear as to why you would go through this whole process, since there really is just a statistical chance that you would end up here or here. So why not just make them roll a die to see if they end up here or here? I'm not sure what the procedure really adds to it. I like a lot more player engagement where players are actually examining the environment and figuring out how this puzzle works and then solving it on their own. My preference would be for something like that. However, in summary, it is a extremely well laid out dungeon. There are a lot of great items in here. There's a lot of great monsters in here, and it is far easier to run than a lot of adventures that I've looked at before, just because of the way that it's formatted. So it is something that I would run in the future if I needed a quick adventure with a lot of horror themes baked into it that I wanted to throw the players into. As usual, if you want to check this out for yourself, you can head down to the description below where I will have links to where you can pick it up. And thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you guys next time.